Hello, everyone. We come together here to celebrate the life and achievements of Detlev Vagts. As you will soon hear, Detlev's contributions to the field as a truly preeminent great scholar are well known. Perhaps less well known is his long-time dedication to the Society. I want to thank Karen and Lydia Vagts and the Vagts family for their generous gift, which enabled the Society to create this annual event. And this is one of my favorite events. I was honored to be part of the very first Vagts panel, and it was on the ethics of arbitration. And in the years since, I've been delighted to watch this event grow in significance. So to start us off, I'm pleased to share with you a special message that Karen and Lydia have recorded specially for this occasion.
Our father, Detlev Vagts, was a practicing lawyer, academic, author, and advocate for the field of transnational legal practice. He joined ASIL in 1961 and remained a devoted member for over 5 decades. ASIL was a professional home for him, a place where like-minded, internationally focused legal practitioners and scholars could convene. Every spring, there was a certain major event that he was sure to attend. On the home front, Dad was modest about his professional accomplishments. It was not until he passed away in 2013 that his family came to understand the extent of his contributions and influence. The remembrances from his peers made us realize that the work he wanted to support needed to continue, and ASIL seemed like the right organization for doing that.
Working with ASIL's leadership and key advisors, we decided to support a new program called the Detlev F. Vagts Roundtable on Transnational Law. Starting in 2016 and continuing for 10 years, the roundtable consists of a panel featured at the annual meeting. Each roundtable focuses on a different topic, but all topics reflect Dad's interests in promoting transnational law, interdisciplinary focuses, legal ethics, and the work of new scholars. The annual event provides a forum for a multi-sided and often lively discussion of a hot issue that reflects Dad's concerns. We are very grateful that ASIL has helped us provide this memorial to our father, which we hope will inspire future generations of transnational legal practitioners.
It's now my pleasure to introduce the convener of the 2020 Roundtable, Professor Rochelle Dreyfus. Professor Dreyfus holds a BA and MS degrees in chemistry and was a research chemist before she decided to become a lawyer. Following law school, she clerked for Judge Wilfred Feinberg of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and for Chief Justice Warren Burger of the U.S. Supreme Court. She's a member of the American Law Institute and served as a reporter for its intellectual property, principles governing jurisdiction, choice of law, and judgments in Transnational Disputes Project. She was a member of the National Academy's Committee on Science, Technology, and Law, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services Advisory Committee on Genetics, Health, and Society, and she served as a consultant to the Federal Court Study Committee, the Presidential Commission on Catastrophic Nuclear Accidents, and the Federal Trade Commission. Professor Dreyfus has organized this year's roundtable on a very timely topic, conceptualizing intellectual property as a social determinant of health. The Society is honored to have her with us to lead this discussion. Professor Dreyfus, over to you.
Muted.
Professor, your mic is muted.
Sorry about that. All right, so thank you very much. It's very nice to have been chosen to moderate this panel, and so great to hear from the Vagts family and to learn a little bit about Detlev Vagts. And it's really a pleasure to do this roundtable. Now, as you heard, the roundtable seeks to promote the scholarship of an emerging academic, and I had the pleasure of selecting this year's presenter, Anna Santos-Rutschman. I chose Anna way back in 2019 before I knew anything about this epidemic. I'd been actually focusing the roundtable on choice of law in IP cases. But then I heard Anna speak, and I was very attracted to her work. And as it turns out, she's the perfect person for this moment. She's currently an assistant professor at St. Louis University. She earned her first degree at the Catholic University of Portugal and her U.S. law degree at Duke University. At St. Louis, she's associated with the Center for Health Law Studies and the Center for International and Comparative Law. She's been named a Bio-Intellectual Property Scholar by the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, and has served as a consultant to the World Health Organization. And much of her work, as you heard, is on the relationship between intellectual property law and health law. And she'll be talking today about the IP framework for determinants of health. Now, Anna will speak for around 10 minutes, and then in the Vagts family tradition, we'll get comments from panelists with a broad range of perspectives that they will bring to bear on this topic. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep these introductions extremely short. I assume you all know how to Google to find out more about them. So first, Luca Birchie comes to us from the Graduate Institute of Geneva, where he teaches in the Global Health Law and International Institutions program. Prior to joining the Institute in 2012, he was legal counsel at the World Health Organization. Margaret Chan is the Donald and Linda Horowitz Professor for the Pursuit of Justice, which kind of says it all. She's at Seattle University School of Law, and she writes on global intellectual property institutions, the production of global public goods, and human and sustainable development goals. Bhavin Sampat is an associate professor of health policy and management at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Most of his work is empirical in nature, and among other things, he looks at drug and life science policy in the US and in developing countries. And last but not least, we have Judith Rios Sanwan, who is a policy specialist at the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. She was previously the Access Campaign's U.S. manager and legal policy advisor at Doctors Without Borders, and I won't say it in French, MSF. Right. She's a lawyer and has worked with several NGOs operating in the IP sector, and she's an advisor to NYU's Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy. So Anna, you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. I am very grateful to ISIL for this opportunity. I'm grateful to the Vagts family, to our convener, Professor Dreyfus, and to the panelists on this roundtable for the opportunity to reflect on the interplay between our international and global IP regime and the determinants of health. And as Professor Dreyfus noted, this is, of course, a very timely period to interrogate the relationship between the need for and access to health-related technologies, as well as the laws that incentivize investment in and the production of these technologies, and matters of equitable access to drugs, medical devices, and vaccines. Right now, we are in the midst of one of the most prolific vaccine races in history. My research for the past 5 years has focused on the role of intellectual property in catalyzing research and development, R&D, in vaccines, particularly if there's no large-scale public health crisis like COVID now or polio before. And of course, in a world of scarcity, where literally it is sometimes impossible to produce and distribute as much vaccine as needed, for example, the follow-up research question for me is to ask how allocative decisions are made when we have patent-protected health technologies that can help us mitigate transnational outbreaks of infectious diseases and prevent future flare-ups of diseases like Ebola, Zika, or COVID. In reflecting about these questions and then in situating vaccine-specific problems within the larger universe, basic or fundamental health goods that populations afflicted by a particular disease need access to, I found myself thinking about the ways in which IP permeates decision processes in global health, both in terms of informing which types of health goods are produced and when, and in terms of who is able to access, or in some cases, have priority access to these goods. In doing so, I revisit the scholarship of Professors Dreyfus and Chun here with us today, as well as Professors Reichman, Okadiji, Mercurio, Matthews, just to name a few, as well as several other scholars who have long inhabited the international IP law and policy space. Now, from these scholars and many others, many of us working in the health innovation and the access to medicine areas have learned about the world of globalized and globalizing IP rights, particularly since TRIPS established floors for mandatory levels of IP protection. And we also learned that as we are closing in on 3 decades of TRIPS implementation, levels of protection have escalated consistently upwards through the proliferation of bilateral and plurilateral investment and trade agreements. Now, in such a world in which so many innovation systems and business models are structured around patent race models, over-reliance on IP can often be at odds with the development and distribution of goods needed for epidemic and pandemic diseases. In the paper that served as a basis for this roundtable, I included a few case studies on the misalignment between IP dynamics and global health. And the case studies included vaccines, agricultural biotechnologies, and HIV/AIDS drugs. Today, I'm going to speak primarily about the case of vaccines as an illustration of the 2 main problems triggered by this misalignment I just mentioned. The one thing you need to know about vaccines is that they are a relatively simple form of technology, and we're very good at developing them, as the current race is illustrating. The problem is that vaccines, apart from the ones that are mandatory according to national vaccination schedules, are not moneymakers. And in fact, if you read the business plan of many companies, it will explicitly say that the companies expect to lose money on many vaccines. Vaccines are eminently preventatives. The opportunity for repeat consumption is very limited, if any. So IP in its traditional function as a catalyst to investment in risky and expensive R&D mostly fails in the case of vaccines. We have technology that can be easily adapted to target emerging infectious disease pathogens. We have scientists and institutions like the WHO providing us with lists of vaccine-preventable diseases for which we have no vaccines. So we have a plan, we know what to do. But absent an outbreak, very little R&D attention goes into these diseases. Now, usually, a catastrophic public health crisis temporarily cures this market failure. The previous Ebola outbreak in 2014 illustrates this case. The problem is that technology developed prior to an outbreak that would be ideal to have as an outbreak begins often lingers in pre-development stages with no attention being paid to it. That's what happened with the leading vaccine candidate for Ebola, which was developed in the early 2000s, and in violation of contractual provisions in agreements transferring technology from the public to the private sector and working requirements that we often associate with the grant patent rights. In violation of all of this, the vaccine sat on the shelves of the company that acquired the IP to develop this vaccine. What's more, the company acquired this IP for around $200,000 US, did nothing to develop the vaccine, and once the outbreak began, took another 3 months to further negotiate transferring the IP along for a combo of $20 plus $30 million to a larger company. Now, This is obviously a dysfunctional situation, but it shows how IP, on top of having an incentives problem in areas related to emerging infectious diseases, has a transactional problem in that it can be used to generate situations that are highly inefficient and detrimental to public health, like the one I just described. So we typically have an R&D incentive problem that can be cured to some extent. In the case of Ebola, by the time it was cured, the population on which to test the vaccine was already dwindling. Now, this reminds me also of things we've witnessed elsewhere outside the vaccine ecosystem. So the case of HIV/AIDS drugs I briefly mentioned and that I address in the paper, it motivated developing countries in the global south to either use or threaten use of compulsory licensing of patented drugs to guarantee access to these life-saving drugs. And even today, in the global north, right here in the US, we officially have epidemic levels of HIV/AIDS across the south, across rural areas. But price gouging by the manufacturers of prophylactic HIV drugs means that the populations the most indicated for these drugs are precisely the ones who cannot afford them. And as in the case of HIV/AIDS, populations throughout the global south, as well as impoverished populations in the north, particularly Black and Latino, are the ones which shoulder most of the public health toll of these infectious diseases. Which brings me to the final point that the paper makes. National and international public health law literature has long recognized the existence of determinants of health, which are normally defined as sets of socioeconomic conditions that affect health risks and health outcomes in the world. Now, determinants frameworks are widely used to identify and fine-tune public health interventions at both the national and international levels, in the global south and in the north. They include factors like healthcare, education, potable water. IP, as well as technology and innovation policies, for example, are not considered a factor in analysis informed by determinants of health. So my contention here today is that intellectual property should be regarded as a socioeconomic determinant of health on a global scale. If you consider the diseases that cause epidemics like Ebola, HIV, COVID, and for which in many cases we lack consistent vaccine R&D, or for which we have drugs priced prohibitively for those who need them the most, IP has a determining effect in health outcomes. It plays an active role in determining that some types of drugs get developed more consistently than others, and it can be used to exclude access to health technologies by indicated populations. IP influences, in some cases, determines health outcomes, often accentuating the global south-north divide, as well as racial and minority divides. So what good would it do us to recognize IP as a determinant of health? Well, unlike IP, the legal framework for transnational public health interventions is much less based on hard law, a point I thank Luca Birchie for bringing to my attention as we were preparing for this discussion. The international IP governance system is not quite addressing the repeated failures of IP regimes that bear a direct effect on the outcome of public health crises. We need more institutional players in the public health space who are fluent in international IP language and who can help advocate for the use of TRIPS flexibilities, such as compulsory licensing. On an encouraging note, in the middle of this pandemic, we've seen several countries from Chile to Israel to even Germany actively signaling they will resort to compulsory licensing if need be during COVID. Moreover, we also need more non-IP players and non-IP mechanisms involved in tasks that traditionally are ascribed to IP incentives. After the 2014-16 Ebola outbreak, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, was developed, the very first public-private partnership exclusively focused on funding and coordinating vaccine R&D. CEPI is now one of the main funders and coordinators of COVID vaccine research. So essentially, we need IP, the situations in which it's needed, and the situations in which it chronically proves not to be the best way to pursue public health goals, to be even more acknowledged outside IP fora. The global access to medicines movement, the leverage that some countries are able to exercise through compulsory licensing, the need for multi-party transnational public-private funders and research partnerships. And I would add that at the more basic level, the fundamental mission of pursuing public health goods and taking steps towards achieving health equity, all of this, in my opinion, speaks to a range of legal and policy mechanisms that are still underused. So if nothing else, we need IP to be regarded as a determinant of health, because TRIPS and non-IP mechanisms provide us with more flexibility and room for creative interventions at the international community level, and we need other players to be able to see that. That's the gist of the paper. That's the gist of the argument I'm making and the direction my research has taken on. And again, I'm very grateful for ISIL's support, and I look forward to everybody's comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And I'm going to turn it over to Maggie Chan, who'll start us off talking about the TRIPS agreement.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, and thank you, Anna, for presenting a summary of your wonderful paper. You're deeply engaged with the law of pharmaceutical innovation and also at the same time very deeply committed to a public health perspective on law. And for many reasons, these two domains speak past each other. And so your paper provides a basis for having a common shared vocabulary, if not a complete language. And so as I was thinking about this presentation and my comments, I realized that there are a number of people here who may not be experts in intellectual property law or international intellectual property. And so I prepared these slides to give us this common baseline for making sure that we can talk to each other afterwards in the discussion. IP is just one of many legal and policy levers, as Anna just pointed out. And so here are some. I hope you can see them on the slides. And within IP, there are many sub-levers, some of which we'll get to when we talk in the Q&A and in this discussion. And each of these levers that you see here, have I lost the slides? Okay, I can't see the slides. So there they are. Each of these levers can be placed in a second matrix along the dimensions of public and private law mechanisms. So IP is squarely within the market-based private space of promoting innovation, but it overlaps significantly with public law and public funding. And that's something that is really, really important to keep in mind. And ideally, healthcare innovation requires a holistic view of the healthcare sector, which includes safety, efficacy, risk-benefit, and patient access and availability to new diagnostics and therapeutics. And pharmaceutical innovation is a unique innovation space because it implicates human health, which is arguably a fundamental human right. It's also complex and expensive innovation, which is risky, often risky from the point of view of the firms engaging in it. We see this uncertainty in results playing out now with the COVID-19 vaccine rates. So much of what frames this specific paper and indeed the general dialogue around pharmaceutical innovation is TRIPS, which is the IP addendum to the WTO agreement. And all observers agree that the grand prize of TRIPS was Article 27, which states, as you can see here, that patents should be available for all fields of technology. And this raised the minimum standards of TRIPS patent protection across all WTO member states, some of which had not previously protected pharmaceutical products with patents. It not only broadened the scope of patent protection, but it also provided for limited exclusions from that protection. And so it has 3 exclusions from its broad scope, none of which apply here. I'm sorry about the animation. And in addition, though, TRIPS Article 7 and 8 do recognize that there is a public health exception for the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. But at the same time, the limitations that were left in place are very, very narrow. As long as they pass the 3-step test, there may be certain limitations, and then it also provides for one form of compulsory licensing, including a specific procedure under Article 31. So for many years, access to medicines advocates focused on the limitations of this particular Article 31, and their arguments were based on a public health approach to what are essentially market-based mechanisms. So after many years of advocacy by civil society groups such as MSF and others, TRIPS was amended, and TRIPS Article 31b now allows exceptions to Article 31, which had allowed compulsory licensing only for use in domestic markets, thereby preventing a low-cost drug manufacturer based in country A, for example, to export drugs to country B. Despite the potential for cross-border compulsory licensing of pharmaceuticals provided by this new amendment, it's only been invoked once so far, and many industrialized countries, such as the United States, have opted out of this mechanism. So that is the public international law framework and health innovation impasse against which all of this discussion takes place. And returning to health innovation, Anna reiterates that the basic public health starting point is that health is comprised of many determinants, including market-based IP law. For example, the COVID-19 outbreak has shown that morbidity and mortality not only depends on exposure to the virus, but many other factors, including socioeconomic factors. Similarly, one could argue that other domains such as food security, which is another case study in her paper, or climate change mitigation, or fill in the box or circle with your favorite global public good, are also determined in part by IP. And so IP touches upon all of these different areas. Much of the international IP debate has revolved around the flexibilities or lack thereof within the public law framework of TRIPS. This public law wiggle room or policy space has been excavated pretty thoroughly. But global health innovation consists of many mechanisms, including but not limited to IP or other public law frameworks, as Anna has pointed out. With this paper, Anna has put a stake in the ground by declaring that IP is a determinant of health, and that she also emphasizes a transnational approach, which goes beyond the treaty framework and posits that non-state private actors may contribute to cross-border health innovation, as well as the production of other global public goods. So this project contextualizes international IP in two important ways, I think. First, as part of a larger global public goods ecosystem, not just a standalone legal regime governing innovation, and as part of a larger governance system, which is comprised of both public and private stakeholders. Her approach is aligned with other scholarly efforts that have linked international IP with other social goals. Transnational approaches to other innovation include analyzing the correct mix of public and private inputs and actors, what the optimal institutional arrangements are for the production of public goods, especially complex innovations such as pharmaceuticals. She offers two possible new approaches: liability rules, also known as take and pay regimes, which allow follow-on innovations to pay an objectively determined value for someone else's entitlement. This approach is based on the path-breaking Cathedral piece by Calabresi and Malamud, and the emergence of large-scale public-private partnerships, which have come into existence in the health space since the 1990s. And so regarding public-private partnerships, we would need more information about how IP is licensed to the partners or downstream manufacturers and distributors to know whether they will make a difference in the availability and affordability of pharmaceuticals. And I don't think we really have that information for much of the activity going on right now. I'm sure we'll have time to talk more about both of these proposals in the Q&A. For now, I'll end with the observation that while public health and international IP law do not share a full set of common norms, Anna is committed to bringing the conversation closer together. The global COVID-19 emergency provides a timely case study of an urgent pivot to this health determinants way of approaching IP-protected innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. And now I think we should turn to Gianluca and hear about international organizations.
Many thanks, Rochelle. Many thanks for inviting me. Like Catherine, I was also a sort of regular attendee of the Detlev Vagts Roundtable when I attended the annual session of the American Society. So very poignant to be here as a commentator. And many thanks to Anna for her paper that was very thought-provoking. So I have 5 minutes, and I limit myself to a number of comments. The first is that, in a way, I was looking again at the social determinants of health as they came out of the work of the WHO Commission in 2008, and how they've been developed by the work of WHO and other actors. And it's true that the dimension you raise is missing from that framework. That sort of structural economic dimension that it can be symbolized by IP among other private rights is kind of missing from that equation. So I think it's good to raise the discussion concerning that. Now, the social determinants have been a moderate success, I think, because they haven't generated, I think, the big political momentum that some people expected, but they did generate a number of follow-on framework. For example, in WHO's parlance, the so-called health in all policy, the WHO is pushing very much. Former Director General Margaret Chan said every minister must be a minister of health. That was a way to emphasize the issue, but fundamentally it's what we are talking about. So if we take that into context, first of all, the social determinants are not the only frame to try to remedy distributed problems, inequities, and so on. And there has been a lot of mobilization around IPs, around other structural elements of the pharmaceutical market, culminating with the famous or infamous 2016 report of the high-level panel convened by the Secretary General that brought the discussion back to patents or lives, which I think was unhelpful in promoting a broader discussion. So where is a broader discussion? Patents are only a part of the picture. And you yourself, in your paper, one of your case studies is precisely for pandemic medicines, but also for neglected medicines. It's the lack of investment. There is no interest for the pharmaceutical companies to invest in medicines where there is no prospect of profit. Then if you take it from that perspective, patents and other IP rights are not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is how to remedy the failure of the market. And that, like it or not, implies a strong investment by the public sector and by the philanthropic sector. So IPs are a part of the problem, but I would invite you not to lose sight of many other pieces of the puzzle that are very important in generating research and development for new medicines and trying to guarantee equitable access when we have medicines. And here you have a number of experimentation of solutions that have been tested or that are on the drawing board, from the push and pull mechanism that Margaret talked about to more extreme proposals like a treaty on pharmaceutical research and development, to the work of product development partnerships, the financing and leveraging intellectual property in this case in a positive sense to try to encourage investment in new medicines. So it's a complex landscape that I think is broader than IPs, and is also no longer a matter of global South and global North. Because the issue of the price of medicines and the United States is a very good case study, has become global. The price of medicine now is a permanent item on the agenda of the European Council. And it was started by the Netherlands, which is a country that is not terribly friendly with patents. So it became a global issue. And that globality has changed the political dynamics and has maybe rekindled the interest in a social determinant approach to this problem. Finally, as Margaret said, COVID, I think, is sort of mixed the cards together. If you look at the WHO website, you have plenty of initiatives. For the moment, unfortunately, sometimes limited to big political statements. But the political statement means something. There could be a change in the making, because there were clearly a commitment to making collaborative research and development and try to work on equitable access, scaling up manufacturer, transferring technology, being particularly sensitive in licensing policy, and so on. So sometimes it takes a big crisis as an opportunity. So we'll see whether COVID is turning a page on this aspect of access to medicines. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So since we're thinking about institutions, and Judith is now at the UNDP, I think we shall turn to Judith and hear what she has to say about that, and perhaps a little bit about your former advocacy work as well.
My pleasure. First, let me start by thanking the Vagts family for the opportunity, and second, to Professor Rochelle Dreyfus for organizing this panel. I'm a long admirer of Professor Dreyfus' work, and I'm honored by her invitation. I want to also recognize Professor Ana Santos-Rochmans and the fact that there's young authorship going into this field, and also my distinguished co-panelists. I do agree that this is going to be a very interactive discussion, and I do agree with my fellow panelists that this topic couldn't be more timely, and it's highly relevant to the current COVID epidemic, as well as to many other epidemics and diseases that affect the life and the health conditions of Americans and many other people around the world. First, forgive me as a lawyer to start by two disclaimers. I am not an academic, and although I have worked for Doctors Without Borders, Knowledge Ecology International, and other NGOs for over 12 years, I have recently joined the United Nations system, and I work for UNDP, as Professor Dreyfus explained. So I do not have an advocacy role in my current job. We mostly focus on supporting governments and other international stakeholders and national stakeholders and creating policy coherence in legal and policy frameworks to promote both innovation and access to medicines. Secondly, I do not represent any organization that I'm currently working or I have worked in the past, and I do most likely do not represent any future employer neither. So let me start now by moving to Professor Santos' papers and basically congratulating her for her excellent paper and for focusing not only on the challenges that she has identified, but also on trying to come up with specific solutions to address these issues. I believe I have three main comments or thoughts on the paper. First, the impact, of course, of non-clinical determinants of health have long been recognized for many years. We all know. They have mostly focused on nutrition, lifestyle, environment, genetics, and most of the interventions and most of the frameworks have been focusing on prevention. We do know the legal frameworks to prevent and control the use of tobacco, and that I believe have been quite successful as a component of clinical and non-clinical determinants to health. Most recently, the impact of race or racism and also the economic inequality and vulnerabilities have also are starting to be recognized with a long overdue recognition. The paper Professor Santos presents a very interesting idea because using this framework, the framework of social determinants of health, aims at paying attention to the importance of incentives for innovation and recognizing that intellectual property is just one type of incentive, looks at the functioning or the existence of incentives as a tool to promote both innovation as well as access to medicines. And as the paper recognized, intellectual property is just one of the incentives that exist, one of the funding mechanisms that exist, but it has been a very important legal mechanism where many players, especially funders and innovators of research and development, have long relied to finance and incentivize innovation. So its functioning or misfunctioning is essential for health systems. I'm not going to go into the history of intellectual property. It's been well covered by my co-panelists, but let me start basically by agreeing. My first thought is agreeing with Professor Santos. Intellectual property is a social determinant of health. As I mentioned, the existence of non-existence of incentive and its functioning can be an enabler as well as a barrier to both innovation and access to medicines, vaccines, and other technologies. The lack of access to medicines has been well documented, as well as the impact on intellectual property, mostly in developing countries. That is the countries where I mostly have been focusing my work until now. I'm happy to give you some numbers to give you the dimensions of the tragedies, the human tragedies that we're facing. So the WHO and the World Bank estimate 400 million people currently lack access to healthcare, including health technologies. Although we have made enormous achievements in the fight against HIV/AIDS, of the 38 million people currently estimated to be living with HIV/AIDS, only half of them are currently receiving treatment. TB, 10 million people living with TB, 1.6 million deaths a year, still many without access to diagnostics and access to treatments. 71 million people currently estimated to be living with hepatitis C, and even if a cure was for hepatitis C had recently reached many regulatory markets and many markets. Most of the population around the world, including in high-income economies, do not have access to it. And then let me not even start with the field of non-communicable diseases. It kills 41 million people every year. and most of the deaths, 75% of them, occur in low and middle income countries. 80 million deaths for cardiovascular diseases, 9 million deaths because of cancer. And this year we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the discovery of insulin, and still millions of people do not have access to it. So this is an old and well-recognized issue, the lack of access to medicines and the impact that IP and incentives and funding strategies have. Professor Santos' papers does a good job on highlighting two new angles of perspective through two of her case studies. The first case study that she addresses, the case study on the drug Truvada used for PrEP as a prevention mechanism for HIV/AIDS, shows that the issue of lack of access to medicines and how intellectual property can become a barrier to competition and therefore an artificial tool to inflate prices is now not only a developing country issue, but it's a global challenge. So I think her case study really makes the point that this is a global issue, and that even here where we live in the United States is also an issue that governments and civil society and other stakeholders are trying to address. Her second case study on vaccines and vaccines preparedness, I think also really does a good job on highlighting the importance of incentives for vaccines and on how intellectual property and patents in this case have been used or are important in terms of to promote innovation, and also what are the challenges also with the system when there is a low level of profitability expected for some vaccines, not all vaccines. Let me just talk to me a little bit more about vaccines and COVID specifically, if I may. The paper mostly focuses on patents as an incentive for intellectual property, as an intellectual property incentive. But we all know that intellectual property is much more diverse as a toolbox for incentivizing innovation and recoup research and development investments. For vaccines specifically, I would like to highlight the importance of trade secrets and other types of intellectual property protection that are equally, if not more relevant as a tool for incentivizing innovation and recovering R&D costs for vaccines. Let me illustrate my point by briefly mentioning an ongoing litigation here in the United States between two vaccine stakeholders, and specifically is a litigation in the courts of Pennsylvania, where the company Inovio and a vaccine company, Inovio, who's receiving important public funding by many governments contributing to the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, and the Gates Foundation has sued another company, BGXI. It's a biologic manufacturer that Inovio hired to make the first batches of a potential vaccine candidate for COVID-19. The disagreement is about trade secrets and the need or not of this vaccine manufacturer being hired by Inovio, the vaccine developer, to share trade secrets on how the vaccine is going to be manufactured with other potential manufacturers to really scale up the manufacturing capacity that will be needed if this vaccine is proved to be effective and safe for COVID-19. The amount of manufacturing capacity that will be needed will be exponential if we need to cover and really vaccinate all the population that needs to be vaccinated to confront COVID. So this is not an isolated case. We are seeing increased numbers of disputes about vaccines companies on issues around trade secrets. We also have seen that some of the biggest manufacturers, for example, Lonza, who is a Swiss company who makes vaccines and medicines and other therapeutics, are expanding their portfolio of patents on the vaccine field. This is kind of a common practice. We have seen a variety of intellectual property protections that are incrementally being used to protect the investments that and the innovations that several of these companies are making. So I'm not taking sides on any litigation, and specifically, of course, not on this one. I'm just trying to make the point that intellectual property matters in vaccine discovery, manufacturing, and future access, and it is therefore a health determinant for vaccines, not only for future access, but to accelerate research and development process. The specific litigation that I mentioned in Pennsylvania, one of the arguments that's being used by the vaccine company is that this litigation is in fact impeding the timely development of this vaccine and the specific research and development processes that they are trying to accelerate in times of epidemics. So what needs to happen? Secretary General Gutierrez and many heads of states have said that any future COVID vaccine, and I personally think any future COVID treatment and diagnostics, I will add, should be a global public good. And we have heard that the concept of global public good is well known. It's been defined in many different ways, but in a traditional usage, basically a global public good is a good that is non-rebellious, it's not excludable, and it's basically available quite broadly. Yes, I have 1 minute left. Thank you.
No, you have no minutes left.
Oh, okay, understood. Sorry. So let me just finish by saying the core message of the paper that I very much agree is the issues of policy and legal coherence between legal regimes. Professor Santos makes the argument about health law. I will argue that there is a need for legal and policy coherence with human rights, legal frameworks, international law, trade frameworks, and sustainable development commitments, including the Agenda 2030. And on that sense, a slightly disagreement, so just to start a little bit of the discussion with my previous panelists, I do think the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines provides a good framework on analyzing policy coherence and strategies to potentially overcome them. Happy to discuss more that during the discussion.
All right, thank you. And Bhavin, economists always get the last word.
I don't believe that to be true, but so I teach at a school of public health where social determinants of health are all the rage, and I'm the only person studying IP, so I'm quite interested in whether we can fruitfully think of IP as a social determinant of health. Thank you, Anna, for a very nice and thought-provoking paper. I have two major questions, and I'll just say them quickly so we can move on to the discussion. The first is empirical, and the second is about framing. Here's the empirical one. The social determinants of health literature, as was mentioned, starts from the idea that there's a strong association between socioeconomic factors such as income, education, characteristics of neighborhood, things like that, and health outcomes. Indeed, those sorts of things seem to explain more of the variation in health than does medical care. So just to give you a sense, the orders of magnitude are huge. Sandra Galea, a former colleague of mine, epidemiologist, recently showed that U.S. deaths attributable to education, segregation, and low social support are comparable to those from heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, and lung cancer, respectively. Michael Marmot's work in England and Wales shows that professional men have an 8-year higher life expectancy than unskilled manual laborers working in the same organizations. So suffice it to say, there are some concerns about whether these are causal or correlations, but if you put those aside from now, I'll just say that the classic social determinants of health, the big ones, the focus of policy intervention, the effect sizes are quite large. And so my first question to Anna is, if we want to think of IP as another social determinants of health, I wonder if we can say something more about the magnitudes of the effects and how they compare to the big social determinants of health. And I've got actually quite a bit to say about that, but maybe we'll save that for the Q&A given timing. The second question I have is about the payoff from this framing. What does this buy us exactly, and how would it help us beyond existing frameworks? So I found in the paper, and I basically agree with almost everything that's said, but I found the discussion to be at a pretty high level of abstraction. So some of my own work with Ken Shadlin, which Anna cites, suggests that what matters for TRIPS is not just the law, but actually how countries implement it. So a concrete way to put this is, as was mentioned, a lot of countries now are rethinking their compulsory licensing laws, are thinking about whether they're flexible enough to allow for the types of access we need. There's strong opposition to those from pharma and from others. And so the question for discussion is, how exactly does framing IP as a social determinant of health, adding to the toolkit, as Anna puts it, how does that affect those conversations? How does that influence the coalitions that support it or oppose it beyond the current framings? So more generally, what's the precise payoff from reframing on the ground? So I'll leave it at that. Those are my big questions, and I look forward to the discussion.
I have to say that was one of my questions too. To whom is the paper addressed? Is it international negotiators who would benefit from this? Is it domestic lawmakers who would benefit? Is it researchers deciding where to put their efforts and funders where to put their money. So I think my questions are very much along the same lines as Bhavan's, is exactly, where does this make a difference?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, thank you all so much for your very insightful comments. And of course, they're more than I can chew right now, but I'll speak sort of to the unifying components of my descriptive portion of the paper and the proposal that we regard IP as a socio-economic determinant of health, which I think speaks to different things that were brought up just now. So the first thing that I would note, particularly in the context of ISIL, is that one of the things that's very specific about current biopharmaceutical innovation in general is that it happens, it changed fundamentally at a point in history in which the legal regime also changed. So IP, and particularly the way it comes often from above its globalized nature from almost the get-go, that makes for a very different type of legal framework progression as opposed to other areas of innovation. So we have truly a global, a trans-border problem, and we need different types of interventions to solve both the incentives inefficiencies and then the transactional inefficiencies in which we can turn IP rights to operate. So I think that the idea of, I wouldn't call it reframing IP as a social economic determinant of health, but pointing out it is also that I think it might help in non-IP fora. That's part of my argument. So I'm thinking that public health fora that normally we don't see involved in IP negotiations that are more on the access side, I would like to have a more robust IP discussion there, for instance. I think it's both for national level policymakers and people who think about international issues, like many of the people attending today. I'm not sure it goes down to the level of researchers, because researchers already depend on funding and strategic decisions being made before, but I think it's important to amplify the non-IP issues and the IP barriers in funding allocation processes, not just within the usual philanthropic venues, but elsewhere. Part of what's really interesting about what's happening with COVID and recent infectious disease outbreaks is that the technology, most of it is not as complex as elsewhere. So I believe that there is room for medium-sized players that are not fully active right now in some of these spaces. So that's why I'm tapping into other frameworks. And as Professor Sampat just mentioned, one of the advantages of IP is that to some degree, albeit imperfectly, we can attempt to quantify some of these degrees of magnitude, some of the dead weight loss. We know how we price certain pharmaceuticals in the US. We know how we price it within the US, and we know how they're priced outside the US. So we do have, thanks to the work of Professor Sampat and other economists and other scholars, we have data from IP and effects of IP that I think can be leveraged in policymaking at multiple levels, so well beyond IP and price controls.
So an issue that we haven't talked about is the question of coordination. It seems like there's so many things going on in so many different places. And of course, some countries are kind of asserting a vaccine nationalism. We're going to vaccinate all our people before any of you get our stuff. And I'm wondering whether this is at all helpful in the coordination problem, whether it's the WHO who ought to be doing that, or whether it's the UN who ought to be doing that. So I don't know, maybe start with Gianluca.
Well, with a crisis of this magnitude, there is a lot of activity, inevitably. And when you have that, sometimes coordination is not easy to achieve. I think that it's fair to say that a lot of action is converging on WHO. At this point, mostly upstream work. So WHO is coordinating clinical trials on vaccine, on antivirals. It serves as a platform, as a coordinator, in particular as a platform for other important initiatives, like the one started by the president of Costa Rica, to have like a sharing place for IP, for licenses, for information, for know-how, for technology, and that's just taken off. And in part is managed by the Medicine Patent Pool, which is another one of these experiments which has been pretty successful. But then you have the partnerships coming in. Gavi has just had a very successful replenishment conference that also had huge pledges for what they call COVAX, which is like an advanced market commitment to try to reduce the risk for companies to produce vaccine. You had CEPI, somebody mentioned CEPI. That has, I think, something like 13, 15 partnerships, one of which with AstraZeneca, that may be the most promising candidate for vaccine. And they pledge 300 million doses at very, very, hopefully, reasonable conditions for developing countries. So you have let 1,000 flowers bloom. At some point, I think things will whittle down and there will be a better coordination. But at this point, I mean, I think that some competition, some redundancy is not too bad.
So a question from the audience: in implementing the central argument, how does one practically address power imbalances among the actors lobbying for stronger IP as opposed to the advocates for access to medicine?
I guess that without dodging the question, my answer is quantity and quality. And, part of the imperfect analogy here, but I'm north of Seattle right now, where half of the cars in my street say Black Lives Matter. And we are seeing some mobilization behind causes that have been, dear to many through time. But now we are seeing a different kind of momentum behind that. In my own little world, I'm working with some people who are doing very important and fascinating work on the intersection between IP and the perpetuation of racial divides. Racism is considered one of determinants of health. When you begin to tie the dots between certain IP attributable effects and something that's already established as a determinant of health, and you provide a more holistic view, which, again, is informed by many of the things we discussed here, but that not all interest groups, necessarily know about or act on, then I believe that it's possible to build momentum if we can share this notion that intellectual property can be seen to have structural effects, pretty much like some of the socio-determinants of health we already respond to. So that's from a practical perspective. I think we break some of those barriers and we build some momentum. So we have louder and qualitatively different voices making noise and voting and doing other things.
Well, on that note, that we should all vote, I will end by thanking the panel and especially thanking Anna and thanking the opportunity. Thank you all very much. And to the audience, whoever is out there, bye-bye.